My name is Kimberlee Monroe. I am the Director of Client Services for Empower Tehama up here in rural Northern California. We are a 501c3 nonprofit victim service provider, providing wraparound comprehensive services for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, stalking, and child abuse. I've been in this field for about 7 years now. I'm a participant on the Women's Foundation Home cohort as well, which really elevates the concept of the link between domestic violence and homelessness. So I'm very honored to be part of this collaboration today. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer Willover. I'm the housing analyst with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence Policy Team. And we often refer to ourselves as the partnership, and we are the statewide recognized domestic violence coalition. So we support agencies like Kimberlee's throughout the state that provide direct service work to survivors in California. And I work closely with our home cohort and our other housing policy efforts throughout the state, focusing on advocacy and policy around housing at the state and local level.
I think I would just start by saying domestic violence has a direct correlation to homelessness across the nation. DV also does not discriminate. DV is domestic violence, does not discriminate. It affects all walks of life, irrespective of upbringing, socioeconomic status, location, age, gender. That being said, our unhoused population are some of the most vulnerable and significantly impacted populations. And I think it's important to elevate what is unique with those vulnerabilities is that they can be exploited very easily. Vulnerabilities such as hunger, shelter, and other critical needs can be used and leveraged against homeless populations to meet needs. And it's a gravely underserved population that we really try to elevate that link between domestic violence and homelessness. It's an inextricable link. I think it's important to recognize that a domestic violence victim, male or female, gender regardless, fleeing from a domestic violence situation is homeless. You're leaving everything that you know, your safety, your parameters behind, and you are by definition homeless. And so it's on the domestic violence service providers to recognize that we have a duty to meet that need and bridge these critical populations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in addition to everything that Kimberlee shared, I think that one of the big highlights I wanted to touch on was that domestic violence is a large driver of homelessness because so many survivors of domestic violence do face some level of financial abuse. And so when survivors are looking to leave a situation that is unsafe, regardless of what their financial situation was beforehand, due to a lot of the control and power dynamics that happen with domestic violence, survivors are often leaving with little to no financial resources, which makes securing safe and affordable housing very difficult. So a lot of times they are choosing between staying in an unsafe situation and maybe having some stability in terms of taking care of those basic needs, or facing homelessness while they work to rebuild their financial and social networks and resources. Yeah, so we've been pretty fortunate that in the last couple of years, we've had some really good studies come out specifically looking at homelessness in California, and they highlighted domestic violence. And so I'll say, for example, when we were evaluating the domestic violence housing first programs in California, which is a flexible funding program for survivors of domestic violence, the data that they showed shared that about a little over 50% of women experiencing homelessness reported domestic violence as the main cause of their homelessness. And then when we're looking at women who are experiencing homelessness with children, that number actually goes up to almost about 80% who report that domestic violence was the main cause of their homelessness. And so looking at those factors in addition to just the economic state of California, what our housing situation looks like, being in a tough housing market, homelessness for survivors is very prevalent in California.
Thank you for that question. And thank you, Jennifer, for having those statistics kind of on a statewide level. I really can only speak to our rural community up here in Northern California. But I will say with that, I'm in complete agreement in terms of this being a gender-based issue that really impacts women. I think in terms of our services, specifically in-house, our ratios are about 80% female and 20% male. So that kind of resonates back to the statewide statistics that Jennifer was speaking to. Aside from that, being a rural community, the infrastructure just isn't there to really wrap around and provide critical services for unhoused populations. We really work hard to continue to provide even the domestic violence and sexual assault services that we do in our community as a nonprofit-based entity. And so having that lack of infrastructure, like Jennifer described, having that lack of affordable, available housing, we are pressed up against a lot of challenges. While we can wrap around these housing populations and get them into critical services, engage with them in terms of permanent placement and permanent supportive housing, the resources that are available, particularly in California and in rural areas, it's just not there to support the high level of need that we have in our communities. It's a systemic issue that we really need people to recognize. It takes a community recognizing these issues and rallying together to really make that change and create more housing opportunities for these populations. And I can speak to that just again related back to a rural community. I can say without doubt that those populations remain underserved. And I don't think that's unique to my community either. Making sure that we have equitable, culturally inclusive services for our populations is absolutely critical. There are cultural norms and things that contribute to a person who may be Indigenous, Native, survivors of color that prevent them or that put barriers up for them to be able to safely seek services. And it's just so critical that we work to, one, recognize what those barriers are and do our due diligence to remove them. Locally, again, our populations are heavily Spanish speaking and very often monolingual. And so we have really rooted into making sure that we have culturally inclusive in-language service providers to bridge services to those populations. I think cultural inclusivity is also critical. It matters to hear from somebody that you identify with culturally and who can speak to those unique cultural norms and understand some of those nuances that I personally may not be able to understand. And so it is our duty, again, to provide people with a safe space and a culturally inclusive arena to share their stories and to seek help.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we're talking about economic inequality and displacement for folks who are experiencing homelessness that are Black, Indigenous, Native, survivors of color, at the partnership too, we always want to make sure that we're acknowledging that there's a deep history of systemic barriers and discriminatory policies, especially in the housing and homelessness realm, that are still impacting that community today in terms of housing and homelessness services. Particularly, we looking at the history of colonization that has displaced Native communities and continued with the cycle of increased homelessness for Native survivors. And looking in California particularly, something that I think about often when we're looking at our homeless system of care is that for California's general population, Black Californians are a small percent, like less than a quarter. But when we're looking at folks who are experiencing homelessness, Black Californians are very overrepresented in that community. And so recently, there's been a lot of research looking into what's been happening. And I would say that a lot of our current assessments and intake systems with the homeless system of care have not been racially equitable. And that, of course, impacts survivors who are experiencing homelessness. In addition to what Kimberlee said, we definitely always want to elevate cultural competency in shelter services, housing service programs that are also approaching survivors with trauma-informed care and reflecting, that they have peers in their community and in their program that understand the different barriers that they face when they're navigating homelessness and also navigating violence.
I just want to add to that. I think 100% in agreement and elevating the importance of a diverse staff, diversification in leadership, and really modeling that cultural inclusivity across the agency and across your volunteers. It's important that people have representation in order to feel safe and secure in reaching out for our services. And so we really need to prioritize making sure we have adequate representation for the populations that are going to be walking through our door. Yes, absolutely. I think it goes back to that, again, understanding of the inextricable link between domestic violence and homelessness. And again, recognizing that when a person leaves that financial hardship, their security, their safety, they leave everything behind. It is the most volatile and terrifying time in a person's life. It is completely leaving your securities behind and restarting that from the beginning. And so from the moment of intake or for the moment of first response or first contact, we really focus on that holistic, humane wraparound service, identifying the survivors where they are at, letting our services be victim or survivor driven. And not assuming that we know what is best for each individual client, and really tackling these cases through the voice and through the lens of the survivors. The needs are unique. I think it is important to highlight that, just like your question, the unique needs of the unhoused populations. That is an important testament to what the home cohort and what domestic violence agencies need to recognize as they champion this work. And I'm very honored to be part again of the home cohort that really highlights and elevates the importance of recognizing those unique needs. Again, going back to some of those vulnerabilities. Hunger, shelter, and other critical needs that our unhoused populations are facing, it really allows them to be exploited and can create additional polyvictimization and additional abuse within the homeless community. And so while at a moment you think that you're fleeing and leaving all of this volatility and this hostile relationship behind, you end up in a community in which your needs can be exploited. There's a concept going around in some of our homeless communities right now called survival sex. And it's a pervasive form of sexual assault and sexual abuse, but it is not being treated as such yet, because again, it is almost being seen as a consensual act because you are doing something for something. If I have a need that could be exploited, whether it's water, hunger, eggs, a blanket, and I engage in sexual activity to get my survival needs met, those crimes aren't being looked at or wrapped around to the degree of a sexual assault crime or a sexual abuse crime. So some of those nuances, those unique nuances and those needs really need to be elevated and focused on. I also think our role as domestic violence organizations is to believe the victim and to provide that wraparound care, that holistic wraparound care, not just for the individual who is seeking services, but those affected family members, kiddos who maybe witnessed domestic violence, family members who were in the home or who have been affected by the trauma that they have witnessed. And so really extending those services beyond the direct person who's asking for help and making sure that we're providing those ancillary services around the entire family and focusing on the family healing, that sustainability, financial, emotional, and life skills that they're going to need to really make a difference and make a change in their life. One thing that is true in the domestic violence sector is typically it takes about 7 times for a victim to flee from their abuser successfully. They may leave one day and then return the next, a week off, a week on. And we have to always have that open door for our survivors and believe them when they are ready and be here for them and prepared to wrap around for them when they are ready. Being a non-judgment, open door agency that really understands those complex nuances of an unhealthy relationship, and just having a lot of grace and credit for those unique needs and those unique circumstances. If not us, if we as domestic violence service providers don't apply that trauma-informed lens, that holistic wraparound, that connection to the other affected family members, then who? If it's not us doing it, there's nobody doing it. And I think that's just very important to recognize. For me, because, those interactions happen, unfortunately, more often than not, it is important to create that safe space right off the bat, to believe the victim, to have that judgment-free, non-judgmental attitude, to validate, I think is just so critical. It takes courage and bravery to take that first step forward, whether it's your first, second, third, or 100th time trying to flee. I can't elevate enough how much of a volatile and dangerous time it is for when a victim actively decides to flee a perpetrator. And so elevating that, the pride and the courage that it took to take those first steps. I have found a lot of resonation with parents who recognize that them getting their children out of a volatile situation, out of a dangerous situation, is their duty. They are protecting their children and they are making those strides towards a future, safer living environment for their kiddos. And so extreme validation and recognizing the courage and reminding them that we are here when they are ready. That victim-centered, survivor-centered case development is critical. We are not the experts of any individual story. My trauma is different than your trauma, and it's just very important to work in the voice of the survivor. And yes, our role of advocates is to help them make good, sustainable decisions, but really our role is to equip them with all of the information and help them make those decisions on their own. And so I think a victim-centered, survivor-centered application is critical. They know that it is a safe environment to have hard conversations, that they're going to get sound feedback from, and reiterating again that if they are not ready, we are here when they are. Having that open door policy is just an absolute paramount piece of engaging with your victims and expecting them to be able to come back.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I will say, in addition to all the amazing things Kimberlee shared, a big thing about domestic violence organizations that are providing housing services is while they are housing service providers, what makes them unique from other housing and homeless service providers is their focus on trauma-informed care, empowerment, and flexibility. And I think Kimberlee touched on a lot of those pieces. But because survivors' needs are so unique in a variety of ways, but particularly when it comes to housing, some of the most successful programs that have housed clients have had flexible funding streams because domestic violence touches everybody of all backgrounds. When they come to those organizations, their needs are going to be so different. It's never just black and white. And so supporting agencies in their ability to provide flexible funds and a menu of options to survivors so that when survivors are seeking services, they're able to come and make that choice rather than being told what they should be doing. They're able to make that decision and that power. And so, you know, for example, when I used to work at a rental assistance program for survivors, we would get clients that come who really their need was mostly financial. They needed support in getting rental assistance, a security deposit, and moving in, and they were good to go. And other folks came with a higher level of need and maybe more barriers. And so with flexible funding, organizations are able to do that. Like maybe they just need help with paying for childcare while they get a job so then they can secure housing. And really, organizations have been so successful in that, and survivors feel so supported when they're able to go and have that back and forth conversation, much like we're doing now, where you get to be part of that decision-making process for your life. And so at the partnership, we always are advocating to continue getting flexible funding out to domestic violence organizations and continue to elevate trauma-informed care, which, you know, we would love to expand to partners and continue to teach our other housing and homeless service provider partners the importance of that, because anyone who's experiencing homelessness has probably experienced some sort of trauma at some point in their life.
I think it's also important to elevate that domestic violence and the pattern of a domestic violence story is never linear, and it is never the same from one person to another. It's unpredictable and, again, just not linear. So there's no one rubber stamp of approval or band-aid that's going to resolve or fix each case. Very rarely do we have a victim present who is fleeing and ready to engage or come into shelter or get wraparound services or report to law enforcement. More often than not, it is that cycle of back and forth and keeping that open door ready for when they are ready to make those strides towards their independence. In the meantime, we focus as well on critical safety planning. If you are going to go back home, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go if? Who are you going to call if? Where are you going to store money? Where are your kids? X, Y, and Z. And so again, client driven. If they are not ready, we try to give them that sense of security and safety through a victim driven comprehensive safety plan to where they know who to call, where to go. Establish that plan in the back of your mind, because God forbid if it does get bad, you know, you're not thinking clearly and you're not doing all of that formative thinking. And so being able to provide that service as our victims and allow them to leave the building with a toolkit, something in their pocket, something that they know is going to give them their first sense of independence. It's an important critical time in their lives, and we really want them to have something that shows and reminds them of what to do in those situations, even if they're not at our door and they're not ready to seek our services.
There's a lot of ways that folks in the community can support domestic violence organizations, not only the work that we're doing at the state level with the partnership, but supporting the local agencies in their community. I would say the biggest is that they can not only get involved in whatever way feels right for them, if they want to volunteer with their local domestic violence organization, if they want to be involved with the board, learn what kind of campaigns and needs their local organization is advocating for, so that they can then go into the community and have those educated conversations with other folks. Because something we are continuing to do is educating folks on how closely interlinked homelessness and domestic violence is. A lot of folks don't make that immediate connection that domestic violence is a lead cause of homelessness, particularly for women and children. And so continuing to have that conversation and spreading awareness. In terms of policy efforts, I recommend that everyone stay educated on, what's happening at the state level, and learning about any particular bills or funding asks that maybe their local organization is working on, or staying up to track with what we're doing at the partnership and advocating for on a state level. In addition to, funding advocacy, just staying informed about what type of bills are out there that could impact survivors in a variety of ways, because domestic violence intersects with so many issues that looking at what is happening at the state level and advocating to pass or not pass particular policies that will have an impact on survivors can really do a lot for folks.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Jennifer said. I think awareness is critical, community awareness, and tapping into your networks and making sure you broadcast the cause, broadcast the mission. Volunteers, yes, encourage people to get engaged in your local domestic violence organization. I will tell you, most of them are taking volunteers. We'll take you. Yes, please give us a call. Get exposed to the work, ask questions. The more enriched our DV service providers agencies are with community members, with a rich board who understands the cause and the mission, the better outcomes will yield for our survivors. The DV organizations challenge themselves to connect with their local homeless provider. There is a lot to be learned there as a domestic violence provider and as a service agency, especially as we're focusing on that link between domestic violence and homelessness. There are critical needs, and there are victims, and there are partnerships to be fostered within our local homeless and unhoused population service providers, whether that be your local homeless shelter or you tap into whatever your local continuum of care provider may be. There are important conversations to be had there about making sure that we are bridging those services appropriately and including critical populations that may not even have the life skills or the access to recognize that these services are available. So not only challenging the community to their awareness and making sure we engage them to enrich our staff, challenging DV service providers to look outward as well and bridge those relationships with homeless providers, take a humble look inward and make sure that your services are including those populations.
I also am going to add one other thing, sorry. But when we're talking about homelessness and domestic violence at an advocacy and policy level, I really want folks to know to keep pushing for flexible funding and for funding for housing opportunities across the spectrum, because I feel like there is a lot of focus at times, depending on what's happening in the news or what's happening in the world on different pieces of housing. But because the needs of survivors for housing is so unique, really advocating for consistent funding across the board for permanent options, for rental assistance, and prevention. There is not a lot of prevention funding for survivors to stay housed if that's what they choose to do. And so that's a critical thing for folks to educate themselves on and advocate for if they feel that that's something that they're passionate about too.
I can definitely speak to the men, not just on the victim services side, but I think men play a critical role in this field of work. Yes, our services are inclusive and, there are male victims. There are a significant amount of male victims, and the truth is it is an underreported figure when it comes to males seeking services. There are a lot of societal, cultural, patriarchal norms, those good old boys philosophies that prevent males from feeling safe and secure in seeking services. I'd like to flip that because those are battles that are going to take a while to overcome with consistent messaging and advocacy and awareness. I think it is important to elevate men and as mentors, coaches, teachers, boys, allies within the school, and use them to really be those mentors and those key speakers to those challenges and help us bridge some of those youth male populations. Tapping into our male populations as mentors and allies is critical to overcoming those long systemic barriers that we're talking about when we say it is difficult for males to access services. Representation is critical, and the more we can engage some of those strong male key figures to champion the message, to mentor and provide early intervention for some of our male youth, the better our systems are going to improve. And that is not an overnight fix. That is something that is going to take effort amongst DV service providers, but even beyond that, work at the local school level, work of the high school football team, and making sure that we engage those male leaders in a way that is trauma informed and going to really resonate with those youth male populations and make a difference.
At one point we talked about the inequalities of survivors who are Black, Native, and Indigenous survivors of color who are experiencing homelessness. And so I also wanted to touch on acknowledging LGBTQ plus survivors who are navigating homelessness, who also face a lot of discrimination when it comes to getting into housing programs. Again, Kimberlee was talking about male victims and female victims, and just in recent years, shelters have really opened up to understand that all genders can experience domestic violence and will be taken into the shelter. And so I think that in some areas it's still important that we're elevating those folks and advocating for them to be treated just as equally as any other survivor that's presenting at the door looking for housing services. So for folks who are listening and looking to be involved and advocate for survivors experiencing homelessness, I would first direct them to get educated, not only on what's happening in their local community, but with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. We have a lot of great resources on our website that folks can go to understand what our policy priorities are, particularly for housing for survivors, as well as educational resources on our resource library. We often have a lot of webinars, and we're always open to communicating and talking with folks who are looking to learn more and be involved. Obviously, right now we're speaking because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month during October. And so each year, domestic violence organizations usually do events or awareness campaigns during the month of October. And so that is an easy time for folks to get involved. A key piece for folks who want to continue to support survivors who are experiencing homelessness is to continue supporting our advocacy efforts for an ongoing budget ask for Victims of Crime Act funding. The Victims of Crime Act funding here in California funds a lot of housing service programs for survivors, from emergency shelter to rapid rehousing and transitional housing. So really across the spectrum of housing. And unfortunately, that has been at risk at the federal level and at the state level in recent years. So we're continuing to advocate to make sure that that is a priority in state and federal funding going forward.
I would echo exactly what Jennifer said. We are more often than not challenged by budgetary constraints and needing more funding to prioritize these populations and be able to serve the level of need that is presenting. It's never a good feeling to have to shy people away or have to turn people down for a lack of secure funding or a lack of staffing to be able to provide that critical service. As of recently, I can speak, our agency has been impacted by those VOCA cuts that we're speaking to, and so we continue to partner very closely with the Women's Foundation and the Home Cohort to champion the policies, to attend Policy Advocacy Day, to meet with our legislators and speak to our cause and be those advocates that we are. Internally, it has also been a priority to diversify. We've had to look at our funding streams and really tap into other revenue streams at the federal level and at the local level, because the continuation of our programs and services is just too critical. We're not prepared or equipped to cease our prevention services at the high school. We're not prepared to turn people away who qualify for housing assistance for a lack of budgetary supports. And so that's where we are very committed to look inward. Locally, being a nonprofit, we are so fortunate to have critical partnerships within our community to help fill some of those bridges. But that has been a challenge for our organization as well. And we're very hopeful that through some advocacy and policy reform, that work that we're doing that is already so taxing and hard is made a little bit easier with the appropriate funding streams and prioritization for those DV service providers. Thank you again for having me, and just thank you for your time. To anyone listening out there, thank you for caring about this cause. It takes a village to make a difference in our communities, and we need your support. We need you to be aware of these causes and to help us champion that there are people out there ready to help and who are listening. To anyone else out there who may be needing help, I would just say that we believe you. Whatever your next step is, that's your first step and that's your journey. And we are here to support you now and when you are ready. Most DV service providers operate a 24/7, 365 hotline. Regardless of where you are in the world, you can always call the National Domestic Violence Hotline to get connected to the nearest organization by you. That phone number is 800-799-7233. That number is also 24/7, 365. It takes a lot of courage to take the first steps, and we are here when you are ready.